Dr. Lewis, thank you very much for taking time out of a busy Sunday to be a part of our podcast.
My absolute pleasure. It's lovely to meet you and to speak with all your viewers and listeners.
Thank you very much. And just as I've said, I mean, once I've contacted you and we were talking about, assigning this podcast to the Sunday, I was thinking that, just as most of other people are, that you are free on weekends, but that didn't turn out to be true. You had some work to do for Mindlab International, if I've got it right.
Yes, well, we do. We no longer, the university where we are based is closed now because of COVID. But we have all our conferences and meetings on Zoom, which is a very good way of meeting people. And, we get on fine. We have people who work for us full time, but they're based in, for example, I think one of them is in Cyprus, I think in Greek Cyprus, and one of them is in Germany. So they can work. It doesn't matter where you are these days, does it? You can be anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So we are quite busy 7 days a week. And I think because of the problems with the pandemic, we will probably be working over Christmas, and we're going to have our Christmas holidays and periods after hopefully, after the whole thing finishes.
But I mean, how has the COVID crisis influenced your work schedule? I understand that things are supposed to be, for example, made up for the last time. Is that the reason why you have to work during Christmas, or is it something else?
Well, it's very difficult because we have huge restrictions in this country on movement. For example, over Christmas, they're going to relax the law slightly, but I think they're still going to be very difficult to meet up with family or friends. And so we think it's best just to forget the December the 25th and move it to Easter or something like that. But yes, it's difficult. But because all our work now, when I started Mindlab, we were, which I can talk about later, we were putting electrodes on people's heads to measure their brain activity. But now all our staff we have some neuroscientists working for us, but we also have a lot of mathematicians and physicists and computer specialists. So all our work has now moved to interviewing people all over the world. I mean, we have clients in Nigeria, we have clients in Sierra Leone, we have clients all over Europe. Don't think we've got any clients in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the moment, but nonetheless, we can recruit subjects, and we can carry all our experimental work out simply using computers. So that's made life a lot easier for us than for many companies in this country, I think.
Yeah, especially now during the COVID crisis. Just imagine if you were still working with the electrodes, with the electrodes, it wouldn't be possible.
We wouldn't be allowed to do it. There's no way you could do it safely. So we just basically have closed down. But that was all kind of the way it all started. If you'd like me to kind of go back to the beginning, which is a good place to start a story.
Yes, please.
I was originally going to become a doctor, and I studied medicine at a medical school in London. But then I fell in love when I was 18, very young, and I fell in love with photography. More to the point, I think I fell in love with the idea of the doors which photography, particularly photojournalism, could open for me. Because rather than sort of staying in a laboratory and cutting up dead people, which I never found particularly attractive, I could see the world. I could meet glamorous people. This is my imagination as a 20-year-old, how the world would work out. And so I became a photojournalist, and I worked for magazines all over the world. I worked for Life magazine. I did work for Life magazine in America and Paris Match in France, because a lot of my French, I worked in Paris as well. I was based in Paris for some while, but I was also based in a lot of war zones. For example, in Belfast, which is part of Northern Ireland, where from 1969 onwards, there was a war went on. And my interest was not so much in the fighting itself, which I've always found very dangerous and rather disagreeable, but I was very much more interested in how it affected people, I met people in those days who were terrified, who were very frightened, but they had every good reason to be frightened because they were at risk of life or injury. But other people who were very frightened, who didn't really have any reason to be frightened, that interested me greatly. How could you be very afraid? And in England, it is COVID times, it's pandemic times. There are many people who are very afraid without really understanding why they're afraid or exactly what they're afraid of. They're afraid of the unknown. And so having photographed a lot of war zones and combat zones for many years, I decided to get out of photojournalism and go back to university. And I read neuroscience and I read psychology, and I became a clinical psychologist.
Has there been sort of a trigger in terms of your experiences working in the war zones that triggered you basically to start with the study of psychology, or has it been a gradual realization that you should make a transfer?
Realization. I don't think it was any kind of epiphany. There was no kind of road to Damascus experience. I just, over the time, I thought, I'm here. I'm being a voyeur. I'm just photographing these people misery. I've been photographing these people in great unhappiness, but I'm not trying to do anything to help people. So what could I do? And I thought, I was a little old by that time. I was in my 30s. It's quite old to start to study medicine. Oh, go back to medicine. I mean, I could have done, but I thought psychology was more interesting. And you perhaps can help people, because medical doctors are very good at treating physical ailments. But a lot of the ailments which people had were not necessarily due to any kind of physical changes to the brain. They were due to their emotional experiences and the things, the post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is PTSD, which is a thing we now experience very greatly in people who've been through bad experiences. They will have flashbacks where they, could go back to the scene they were in their imagination. They will have nightmares. And so these are not physical things you could treat by giving them a pill or doing an operation. They are things which really you need to try and understand people on a personal level and try and, as far as you can, see their world from their point of view. So it was a gradual thing, I think. And then I went back to university, and that took me, because I went for a doctorate, a PhD in clinical psychology. And that probably took me about 10 years.
Okay.
That's about the time it takes, which is about the same as getting a medical degree, which is about 7 or 8 years. And then you don't really know anything. And then you have another 10 years probably trying to learn what you thought you were learning at the medical school. Anyhow, so I did that, and I I started working as a therapist. And
what were the first impressions of working as a therapist?
I think a sense of being completely unprepared for what I was taking on.
How come?
The extent of mental illness, not necessarily what we call psychosis, which would be things like schizophrenia or obsessive compulsive neurosis, which really are very hard to treat. You really need a medical background. You need to be a psychiatrist. Because as a psychiatrist, as a medically qualified doctor, you're able to hand out drugs. And a lot of drugs, like schizophrenia, you need to give a drug to bring down the symptoms before you could actually affect any kind of talking cure, if you know what I mean. And so most of my work was concerned with what we in England called neuroses. And these are things like anxiety, depression, perhaps obsessive compulsive neurosis, or that would be on the borderline with psychiatry. But phobias particularly interested me. The phobia comes from the name from the Greek god Phobos, who was the god of terror. And indeed, I understand the Greek soldiers would very often paint a picture of his image on their shields in order to try and terrify the enemy. And so phobias are irrational fears. They're irrational in the sense that what you are afraid of, let's say a spider or open spaces or closed spaces, claustrophobia, or a fear of vomit, about what is called emetophobia. And you might say, well, surely nobody actually likes vomit. You know, it's sort
Yes.
of kind of aspire to see or experience. But it can be a very disabling complaint. So imagine you're a young woman and you're what we call an emetophobic. You're terrified of phobia or vomit. I'm sorry, your phobia is about vomit. So you won't probably have a boyfriend in case you get pregnant. You probably won't go out on a night, particularly over the weekend, in case you see a drunk. You probably won't have any spicy food or any, you know, so your life will be quite limited. You won't go to lots of places where you're afraid.
Mm.
So it's probably something which is worth, you know, not saying we're going to make you love vomit, but we're going to make you so, you know, you won't run away anymore. You may not like spiders. You may not want to have a spider. I'm sorry if any of your listeners are arachnophobes, because it's distressing for some people even to hear. So anyhow, you're not going to love them, but you're going to be able to put up with them.
Yes, and it's also not a matter of just like the way that I usually look at it and that I am actually stopping to look at it from the things that you said right now, is that people, when somebody mentions some sort of a phobia, think, oh, okay, so he is irrationally afraid of, I don't know, doors or whatever. So, okay, don't look at doors, don't do this. But people tend to forget that those doors, whether literal or metaphorical, are all around you. So it's not just a matter of being afraid of doors and the doors influencing you. It's a matter of the whole life being restricted and in anxiety.
Yes, that's exactly right. You see, some of the people I've treated have been bridge phobics about going under or over a bridge. Now you may think, well, just avoid doing that. But try and think how many bridges you have to cross just maybe to get to work or get to your home or go out for, you know, an outing. There are many more bridges in the world than one thinks about. So that's and one of the phobias I was particularly interested in, because it's very disabling, and it's a thing called agrophobia. This is a fear of, well, people think it's a fear of open spaces, but it's not. It's a fear of being away from a place of safety, like a home. So somebody with very powerful agoraphobia, and agora comes from the Greek word for marketplace. So it's actually a fear of going shopping, for example, of being away from home. So I've had some women who have been locked behind their doors of their homes for 20 years, 30 years. They've too afraid to go out. But interestingly, if they've got a husband or an adult child or a teenage child, they will very often feel able to go out with or teenage daughter. They will go out with that caretaker and be okay. So, for example, I've had some women who have been terrified of leaving their homes, but with their husbands or their partner, their male partner, they were able to fly on holiday.
So it might not be a case of the fear of the open space, but maybe of the uncertainty of the unfamiliarity.
That's exactly right. So they can travel by car because they're in a safe cocoon, a steel cocoon. They can sometimes go out in the garden. Very often they can't even go to the garden of their home if they've got a garden. But this gives the husband or the male partner huge control over the woman, because, you know, he likes, well, that's perhaps putting it strongly, but I have come across many cases where, as I began to get the woman more able to leave her house and have an independent life, the husband would resist the therapy, would become very antagonistic towards me. And you know, even say, I don't want my wife to have any more therapy. It's upsetting her. What really happening was upsetting him, because he liked his wife always to be at home. She didn't meet any other men who could compete with him. She had the house nice and clean. She had the cooking all done. So he was getting what we'd call a lot of secondary gains from her wife's disability. And you very often find, not just in psychological medicine, but in physical medicine, the partner, male or female, of a person who's not very well actually gets some gains from that. You know, it may sound bizarre, but you've got to think, what is the other person getting? So are they actually, you know, supporting this person's views? These people may not have anything physically wrong with them, but they may believe that they're ill. And therefore the husband will say, or the partner will say, it could be the wife, will say, oh, I'm so sorry, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. It's to exercise control over other people. A lot of people get a lot of power for themselves, they see, by controlling their partners or people they work with or who work for them.
This is something that I've actually seen, and if people are aware of this, I believe that they can actually find better relationships. This is something that I've discussed with my girlfriend, and we both, her and I, have friends that are with the partner that's either a codependent one or a controllable one. And the thing is, if one of the partners, as far as I can actually notice, is a controllable one, the other one will be the codependent one. So basically, like the differences attract each other, so they can make a coherent whole. So it's something like, it's as if the anxious partner is actively searching for a controllable one.
Yes. What you say is very, very interesting. Absolutely true. We think there have been two explanations put forward to this, because you very often find in a relationship, particularly a long-term relationship, the partners mirror one another in some ways. Now, and if one partner gets ill, the other may get ill. So the explanation for this is two explanations. One is, I don't know how this word can be translated, but it's what is called assaultative mating. And this means that people seek out somebody who will complement their weakness. If they've got a strength, they will look for somebody with a weakness so they can, do you know what I mean? So they're actually seeking out a partner who will match their own needs and desires and feelings. And the other is what we call pathogenic interaction, where one actually starts off quite well, but gradually molds him or herself to match the other person. So you're absolutely right. In close personal relationships, you do see people very often providing the weakness which the other one seeks, or providing the strength which the other one seeks. And it can be, two-way traffic. I'm not being, sexist about this. It can be either way. And interestingly, when agoraphobia particularly was first named, it was first named by a German psychologist called Carl Westphal, and he named it agoraphobia. But all the early papers, if you look at the 19th century and the early 20th century, all the medical papers talked about only male patients. And indeed, one psychiatrist said, I'm very sorry I can't report on any female patients, but then, as you know, there are no female agoraphobics. Now, why should that be? Well, if you think about England, particularly during the early years in the Victorian era, age of Queen Victoria, women were chaperoned. They never went out on their own. If a young girl went out, she would have her mother or her grandmother or some relation or sister always going out with her. So they were never given any independence. And it was really when women were able to become more independent in the 20th century that you started to see an increase in female agoraphobia and a decrease in male agoraphobia. Now, I say that, but it may be that there's not a decrease in male agoraphobia, but that male agoraphobics don't like to admit, they have any weakness.
Yeah.
Now, I had one patient or client who was a government worker. He worked for the government, and he was agoraphobic, but he was able to cover this up. He had his garage where he kept his car next to his house, and you could walk from the house through a door in the house into the garage. He then got into his car and he drove to his office, which had an underground car park, and he would always park directly opposite the door to the elevator, to the lift, and he would go up in the lift and cross the corridor to his office. So he was never really anywhere where he would become afraid. And for 20 years, he concealed this from his wife, from his children, from his colleagues. He thought it would be very bad for him at work if they knew he had this, as he would say, a weakness. It's not a weakness of any kind. In fact, phobic people are some of the bravest people I know, except in terms of this particular stimulus, which produces the high levels of anxiety and panic, which is what we try to seek to cure.
But I mean, how do you usually, generally speaking, how do phobias form? Is it something that's based on experience, or is it something else?
Well, we don't really know how phobias. Sometimes there are some indications. For example, a woman is more likely to become agoraphobic during her period of menstruation. It often develops as a child, as something which, they're taught as a child. An adult may say, without realizing how dangerous, he says, "Oh, don't do that. It's very dangerous. You mustn't touch that spider, for example. He's going to hurt you," which is not true. In England, at least, we have no poisonous spiders. I don't know what it's like in your country.
Neither do we.
But no, quite. I think you have to go to Africa or Indonesia or somewhere. But nonetheless, you see, you can impregnate a child with fear at a very early age, in trying to keep them safe, but actually making them see that is something which is objectively dangerous when it's not. There's a very famous case, actually, to illustrate this. There were two American psychologists called Watson and Rader. Have you heard of Watson and Rader? They're quite notorious. These days they'd be arrested for unethical behavior. But what they did was they took a little boy called Little Albert, who was an orphan child, little baby, and they made him phobic about rats.
Oh, okay.
When they first showed him a rat, he quite liked it. He was a child. He, couldn't see any reason to be frightened of the rat, and so it was a pet rat. It wasn't, a wild rat who was going to attack him, and so he would stroke the rat and be very happy with the rat. So then, every time they showed him the rat, they made a loud banging sound behind him, and he then associated the rat with the sound which frightened him, and therefore he thought it was the rat which was frightening him, and he became phobic about rats.
Okay.
See? And so they then say they what we call deconditioned him. They removed that fear. I don't know whether they did. We don't know what happened to Albert. Little Albert has disappeared.
Yeah, afterwards.
If you go to any psychology textbook, you'll find Little Albert he's become famous, although he doesn't know it possibly. So you can condition people to be afraid of things. So that's how Little Albert. So they then gave the explanation, which is partly right, I think, that all phobias were produced by a learning. They saw it as a learning response. You learn to become phobic, just as you learned to speak English. I learned to speak English when I was 7. And you learned to speak English perhaps when you were 10 or 11 or whatever you started. You're certainly very good at it.
Thanks.
But you've also learned lots of other things. You've learned to speak your native language. You've learned to speak perhaps other languages. So they say, no, a phobia, this irrational fear, is something you learn. You learn it through experience. Now, some people are very good at learning. And so one experience, and they'll learn it. Other people are much slower at learning. So, have 10 experiences. You try to teach a child arithmetic, for example. And some children are wonderful. They know exactly. I had one little boy in one of my studies on intelligence. He taught himself to read at the age of 3.
He taught himself?
Yeah, he does. His mother didn't know. The only time she realized he could read, when she took him to the doctor's, he came with her to the doctor. She was seeing the doctor, and he started to read out a birth control pamphlet on the table at the age of 4.
But I mean, how is that? I mean, like looking at it conceptually, how is that possible to teach oneself something that's outside of like conception?
Child was very, very clever. I was doing a study of children with a very high IQ. Genius children. And he was very good at arithmetic. He actually understood numbers very, very. I'll give you a true story. When he went to a primary school, his first school, at the age of, I think, of about 4. And the teacher was teaching them numbers in this little school. And she drew the number 8 on a blackboard and said, "Children, this is what we call the number 8. But you could think of him as a little fat man with a little fat face and a little round hat on." You see, and all the children think, "Oh, that's interesting." And this little boy, Nigel, his name was, put his hand up and said, "Miss, I have no trouble with positive integers." So I said, "That's actually the term integer, which is the term for numbers." So yes, I think some children are very good, but these children are actually very good at becoming phobic, because one lesson, one experience, and they will learn from it. Another child who perhaps takes 10 lessons to learn the letter 8, number 8, let's say, he may be much more robust. He may not be affected so easily. So it's a level of, so often phobics who become phobic are actually quite bright people, but they've learned the wrong lesson.
Yeah, plus, I mean, from what I've actually observed, or not learned, but heard about, so to speak, to say, if that's the right, expression, it's like, it's not only a matter of intelligence for those people, for example, the high achievers, but it's also a matter of the ability to be obsessed about certain things, and that ability to be obsessed can transfer into negative things as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I've met, I've worked with children, not children, young people, adolescents, who are obsessed. They say they're very good at playing chess. That's all they're very good at. Or they're very good at, I don't know, finding prime numbers up to, the prime number is a number which you can't divide except by 1. So 3 is a prime number, for example, 5 is a prime number. But they just fixated on prime numbers, finding prime numbers up to 1,000 million. They'll tell you which. So yes, you can become obsessed by that. But I don't work with many of those children. But I think some people, yes, become very obsessive. And of course, obsessive compulsive neurosis, it can be a very disabling condition. So a germphobic, for example, may never leave the house because they're obsessively washing their hands. They wash their hands all the time. In fact, sometimes their hands are raw. You can see skin has been taken off the hand by the number of times they wash it and scrub it. So but you're absolutely right. They can become obsessive, but they can learn things very quickly, but they can sometimes just learn one thing. And to be a rounded human being, really, you need to, I personally think, it's just a personal view, that in days gone by, not the good old days, I think it weren't the good old days, in many cases it was very bad old days, but I think they were more likely to be rounded human beings. In fact, they understood literature, they understood languages, they understood mathematics, they understood, they were polymaths, what we call polymaths, which they knew a lot about a lot. Whereas these days, particularly in England, our educational system means you have to focus on one thing.
To specialize.
You have to specialize. If you want to be a scientist, you have to do science. You don't have to do arts. If you want to be an artist, you have to do arts. You can't know anything about science. So we're bifurcating. We're putting people into these two groups. But nonetheless, that's really a sideline. It's just my view on education. I think you need to know as much as possible about as much as possible in order to understand the world.
Yeah, to comprehend the world, basically. I mean, if you're only looking at it through one lens, if you are taught to actually look at it only from one lens, you won't have the capability of, when you're older, when you should be able to take into, the world, the various worldviews into consideration, you won't have developed that ability that you should have developed when you were younger.
You have to understand the world. You can't just isolate yourself in a little, a little pod sort of thing and say, I'm never going to talk to anybody. Because as this coronavirus is shown, the world is one place.
Yes.
And a virus makes no distinction between an Englishman, an American, a German, or, it's just all things. So I think we do need to learn. And I think we have to be more understanding about people's lives and try and see the world we all see the world differently, because we have different experiences. I can never know your experiences, you can never know mine, for which I'm sure you're profoundly grateful. Yes. But nonetheless, anyhow, that's my view. And I certainly think when I try to help somebody, I'm not just concerned with their phobia. I'm concerned with their whole life. What was your life like? How was your, how your relationships, because it all plays into the present state of how the person is. So anyhow, to move on, if you just, I became very interested in studying phobias, and my doctoral thesis was on treating phobias in the community. How you can, well, in society. So I ran a charity. We set up a lot of self-help groups because particularly mental health in the UK is extremely bad. There's not enough people to help. There's not enough money going into the system, and particularly COVID and the social isolation which this has produced, the loneliness this has produced, the fact that in England, if you have a parent or an elderly parent in a care home, in a nursing home, you're not allowed to see her. You're not allowed to touch her. You're not allowed, you may be allowed to go and speak to her through a window.
Yeah, it's
so you imagine what this does emotionally, traumatically to people, and how it affects them in sense in terms of their any neurosis they have. So what I decided to do was to set up self-help groups which would be run by people who had the phobia, a bit like an alcoholics group, a group for Alcoholics Anonymous, or a drug dependency group. Because one of the things you know when you get there is that everybody knows what you feel like, or they know roughly what you feel like. So if you went, for example, if you had a disability and you went to a self-help group for people with that disability, you wouldn't have to try and explain your disability. Or if you had post-traumatic stress syndrome, it very often helps people who've been through terrible experiences, traumatic experiences, soldiers, for example, or police officers or civilians, to go and talk to other people who they know will know exactly how they feel. So we set up these self-help groups, and that was in the 80s, a long time ago now. And we had about 30 or 40 groups around the country, and they had perhaps 20 or 30 members. So they were able to help. We got some quite good results with them. But that aside, I thought if I could help people by showing them what was going on inside their brains, their bodies, when they were becoming very anxious, would that help them? Now, there are devices which you can purchase or construct, which will measure things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, what is called your skin resistance. As you become anxious, you actually become a better conductor of electricity.
Oh, so I haven't known that. So that is the conductivity of electrical current is turned
a very
like
tiny, a galvanic. Well, they're still called. It's very ancient, a galvanic skin response meter. Galvani was one of the early pioneers of electrical measurement, an Italian scientist, I think. But they're actually called, you'll like this, electrodermal. As in electricity, dermal as in skin.
Okay.
The dermis is the skin. So electrodermal activity. But what happens when you become anxious? The actual it's not, you may sweat more, which would obviously make your skin a better conductor of electricity, but there's actually an increase in the conductance below the level of the skin. So this machine sends a small electrical current. You normally attach it to the fingers, and then you can measure the changes. I can send you a video. Just by changing somebody's breath, I can make them more anxious. And I've got a video of that. I have an elderly, oh no, it wasn't elderly, he'd hate me to say that, a middle-aged client, a young middle-aged client. And I just get him to change his breathing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, the breathing techniques are often used in order to calm the anxiety, to calm the person, next to meditation, of course.
Yes, well, meditation is a good form of relaxation. You're focusing your mind on one thing, you're breathing, for example. That's one of the techniques I certainly teach. So I became very interested in Hatha yoga, and we actually now have a charity in England which teaches meditation to prisoners, people doing long sentences for crimes. And they find it very good. It calms them down, so it calms the whole atmosphere of the prison down. You don't want an angry prisoner.
Yeah, of
I
course.
think particularly if you're another prisoner, or if you're a prison officer. So anyhow, so meditation is very good. Hatha yoga is very good.
Why hatha yoga? Why that specific type of yoga? Is it based on breathing
Well,
or?
it's the only one I use. I mean, I'm sure other types of yogas, would be equally well. If the question is, when you're relaxing, you need to try and focus your mind on something other than what you're afraid of. Because when you're afraid, you experience fear, obviously. Now, I define fear, not as most people do, but I define it as an acronym. That is, I find each letter stands for a different word. And I think fear stands for false evidence appearing real.
Oh, okay, makes sense.
So people with a phobia see a spider as evidence they're going to be attacked, or somehow it's going to run up their trousers if they're a man, or if they run up their, or a woman indeed, or run up their skirt if they're a woman or a Scotsman.
Yes.
Who also wear red. Well, they wouldn't call it a skirt, but So this is, but it's false evidence appearing real.
Mhm.
And I think one of the problems now we have with COVID is that many people are what we call anti-vaccinators. They refuse to have a vaccine. But I believe they're seeing false evidence, often spread by social media, which they see as real. So I think one conspiracy theory, which is around in England at the moment, is that when they inject the vaccine, they're actually injecting a microchip into your body.
Yeah, Bill Gates is sponsoring that. I mean, yeah, I've heard stories. It's like
It's
it's
bizarre.
remarkable. It's remarkable.
Yeah. So there's so much false evidence on social media that people believe, and then they become afraid. Anyhow, so I thought if we could show them what's going on in their bodies, they will actually be able to see as they change their breathing, they are relaxing. Their body is physically relaxing. They can see that. So you can measure skin conductors, I was saying, electrodermal changes. We can measure temperature of hands. Now, when you become frightened, anxious, you become cold, because
Yes.
the blood is then sent away from what we call the periphery, that is the edge of the body, and it's sent to the muscles and the brain for what is called the fight or flight response. So when you're afraid, you could do one of three things. You could run away, which is always the action I took, or you can freeze. And very often where people are very frightened, they will just freeze. An animal, let's say a rabbit caught in the headlamps of your car, if you're driving down the road, won't run away, it'll freeze and it'll be killed because of that. But very often in the wild, if an animal is being hunted, say a deer is being hunted by a predator, it will freeze, and it's very much harder to see something which is stationary than something which is moving, because our brain has a predisposition to look for anything moving. So if you put your fingers out to the edge of your eyesight, so you just see it in the periphery, and keep it still, you'll stop seeing it. As soon as you move your fingers, you'll see it.
It's yeah.
So, and the other thing, of course, you could do, you can flee, you can freeze, or you can fight. Now, for either running away or fighting, you need more blood going to your muscles, and you need more blood going to your brain, so you can think very clearly. And so the blood from the hands is drained. And I have got, for example, again, I can send you these if you want, thermal imaging pictures, which show a hand which is anxious, where it's the thermal imaging, which shows the heat as colors, shows it's very cold. And as soon as they start to relax, the hand becomes warm again, it goes red again. So I can teach people to relax. And this is a very good technique for using, for example, if you're in a meeting, if you're a business person in a meeting and you start to become anxious about what is being said and you want to calm yourself down, you can't really physically relax, because that's quite obvious you're doing something rather odd, particularly in a meeting session. But you can do this very discreetly. So I'll tell you what you do. You instruct your hand to get warmer. Okay. Now you can do this in one of three ways. One is you could just tell your hand. Some people are very good at this. you can tell your hand to get warmer. You can imagine the blood flowing into your hand gradually becoming warmer. And if we put a little thermometer or a thermocouple, which measures heat changes electrically, on your finger, you will see the needle moving or the thermometer moving up as people think that. The second way of doing it is to imagine you're holding your hand in front of a blazing hot log fire, and you imagine the flames of the heat coming off your hands, off the flames into your hand. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that will work for other people. And the third thing you can do is you just hold your hand, your palm of your hand, just in front of your cheek. Now, your cheek is a hot spot. And so you will feel the heat. Don't touch your hand. Just don't have to touch it. Just hold it about a centimetre away from your hand. You'll feel heat coming off your cheek. And you can use it to warm your hand. And as your hand warms up, you will become more what we call, again, a technical term, I'm afraid, parasympathetically aroused. Now, there are two aspects to what we call the autonomic nervous system. That is the part of the nervous system which controls your things like your heart, you know, or your breathing. You don't have to think about breathing. You just do it automatically, and you digest your food automatically. And life would be impossible if we had to consciously think about all these activities. So you'd be trying to have an interview like this, and you'd be telling your heart 60 times a minute to keep beating, lads, and your saliva to keep your mouth wet, and your stomach to keep digesting your breakfast.
The multitasking on a whole different level, sympathetic nervous system all the way.
Yeah, and if you start to think about something else for even a second, you die because you're so you need this automatic nervous system, what is called the autonomic nervous system. And that controls your heartbeat, for example. But because it controls your heartbeat, you don't have any conscious control. So if you're panicking and you just say to yourself, oh, stop being so stupid, or you're told very often by friends, don't be so silly, there's nothing to worry about, that's a cognitive, it's not going to help because the thing is being done automatically. It's like a pilot in an aircraft with the aircraft on automatic pilot or autopilot. And the aircraft starts to get into trouble. And instead of taking the autopilot off and flying the aircraft, he sits in his chair and says to them, or she sits in her chair and says to the autopilot, oh, don't be so silly. We don't want to dive into the earth. We want to climb, you know, I'll change altitude. It's not really going to have any effect. And it's not going to have any effect at all on your anxiety. Indeed, it may make it more, you may find it makes it worse.
Yeah. Yes.
Because you're now focusing on what's going on instead of distracting your mind.
Yes. One of the best metaphors that I've actually heard for this, for like solving these sorts of issues, these sort of problems, is like to not and try to solve it from the same place it has originated from. So, for example, if you're thinking about the meeting going wrong, you cannot think your way into that it will go well. You have to solve it from the body, basically.
Yes. Yeah, I'm absolutely right. You see, in any problem, and indeed this includes phobias or includes fears, there are three components to any problem. Every problem in the world has three components. It has the givens, the operations, and the goals. So, and if you get any one of those wrong, you won't solve the problem. So the givens are all the information you have or you know about the situation. The operations are everything you can do to those givens. And the goal is what you actually want to achieve. So you're absolutely right. If your goal is to stop this meeting going wrong, your goal should be, how do we put this meeting back on course? How do we make this meeting go right? What needs to be done? What are the givens? What are the operations I can perform? You know, so an operation could be very confrontational. It's not always a very good man, you know, despite what Donald Trump thinks. Upsetting people is not a good idea, generally speaking. And so, but in some cases it works very well. You know, anger can have some positive outcomes
if used properly.
Well, yes, if used properly, but you know, actually, just getting on to another subject completely. I'm sorry about this.
No, go ahead.
Really, from ancient Chinese times, there have been 5 areas of vulnerability of the human race. And these you can remember by the word flag, F-L-A-G-S. And these are the vulnerabilities which all people, politicians, partners, everybody uses. There's fear, that's the F, anger, and then L is lust. I mean, people are very often misguided by lust. They fall in love not because they like the other person, but because they desire the other person.
Yes.
That's why a lot of marriages end, because they decide they don't like the person they actually thought was very desirable initially. So lust, and that's the L. The A is anger. You make people very angry, you stop them thinking rationally. And you see, an angry mob, for example, in the street, they're not thinking clearly, they're angry. The G stands for greed. Greed is a vulnerability. If you offer people bribes, for example, or some other inducement, they will very often do things which they wouldn't otherwise do. And the S is sympathy. Now, you may think, well, surely sympathy is a very good, positive thing. And it is usually, but it can be used for adverse effects.
Yeah.
And let me give you a good example of this. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there was very little interest in America in becoming involved in the war. And the people were very much against it. And then a young girl appeared before the Senate, I think, in America, and described how, when she'd been in a hospital in Kuwait, the Iraqi soldiers had come in and bayoneted babies and stolen all the life support devices shipped back to Iraq. And there was huge sympathy. I think George Bush, who was then president, repeated this about 10 times. And it aroused a huge anger against the Iraq. And that led to the invasion of Iraq by American, coalition troops, as they call them. But it was completely untrue. It was invented by a public relations company.
Oh,
and the girl was a stooge who'd been coached by the public relations company exactly how to present her story, her fake story, her false evidence.
Oof.
So do you see, they use that in order to manipulate people by their natural and positive idea of sympathy to do something which was very much against everybody's best interest.
Yeah.
So these five things, the fear, the lust, the anger, the greed, and the sympathy, can all be used to manipulate us. And very often I find with my patients, they have been manipulated that way. They've been very afraid, or they've been made very angry, or they've been made very greedy, or they've made very lustful. And this has led to a lot of the complications which later arose in their lives. Anyhow, I feel we're getting off the track. I'm sorry about that.
No. This is all very interesting for me to hear. It's just a matter of the time and how much time we have available. How much time you have available? I'm open to conversations for the whole day.
Okay, so then I decided whether we could measure electrical activity in the brain, because there are certain the brain is an electrical device, or an electrochemical device, and so it produces a very tiny electrical voltage, and you can measure this by putting electrodes, metal skids on the head. And when I was doing this work in the 80s, there were two types of what are called EEGs, electroencephalograms. These are the things with electro, again coming back to electricity, and cephalo is the Latin word for the brain, and gram is also to write. So electroencephalogram, writing the electricity of the brain, in other words, writing the language of the brain. And this goes back to the early 20th century. And there was a man who managed to read electrical activity, actually his 17-year-old son Carl's head for the first time. And he described these as, because they were the first electrical waves ever recorded, as alpha waves, alpha from the Greek letter for the letter A. And so they realized that this was a very good way of measuring, for example, if somebody had epilepsy, or a tumor on the brain. You could detect this by measuring the brain activity. So this became a medical device, an electroencephalogram, and it produced its output by writing with pens on a sheet of moving graph paper. And so these were very useful, but there was no way I as a clinical psychologist, I couldn't afford, our university couldn't afford an electroencephalogram, which were very, very expensive when they first started. But in the 80s, a new device was produced, which was basically a thing called a mind mirror. And it was produced to help people learn meditation. It was produced by one guy who was a Buddhist and another guy who was a very good audio engineer. And they called it the mind mirror. And I bought one of these devices. And I was then able to read the electrical activity in my patient's brain. And what this had, a little screen, I think I've sent you a photograph of this, a little screen with LEDs in it, yes, light emitting diodes, and one for the right side of the brain and one for the left side of the brain. And the further the light moved out in a particular wavelength, it would show you how many alpha waves were being produced. But there are other waves that have been discovered subsequently. For example, beta waves, which are faster waves. So when you're thinking hard, when you're very alert, you're producing a lot of beta waves. So there's alpha, beta, and then there are delta waves, which occur in sleep. And so when you're sleeping, you're going to see a lot of delta waves, you're going to see a lot of theta waves.
And what are the theta waves? You've written about this in your book.
You're found generally in what we call non-dreaming sleep, non-REM sleep. Because what's been found is that when somebody is dreaming, their eyeballs are moving very rapidly under the closed eyelids. So there are two types, this generally comes to be seen as two types of sleeping. There's what we call non-REM sleep, and REM stands for rapid eyeball movement. REM, rapid eyeball movement. So it's non-REM sleep, but there's also what we call REM sleep, rapid eyeball movement sleep, which we assume is when somebody's dreaming. And you would see more theta waves in non-REM sleep when somebody is not dreaming, which is for most of the night. You only dream for about an hour and a half each night. So, if you sleep for 8 hours, it's about an eighth of or so. But as you start to wake up, what is called hypnagogic sleep, and maybe you're half asleep and half awake. So if your partner says something to you, or the radio starts to play on an alarm radio, and you hear something, you may incorporate this into a dream, a strange dream.
Yes, I know, happened repeatedly.
I have a friend of mine who told me a same story. I was appearing on a breakfast show on radio, a program on the BBC called Today program, and his alarm clock clicked into life at exactly the moment I was speaking. And he said, I had this terrible dream you were in bed with me. I said, no. I certainly wasn't. But because he heard my voice on the radio, and it is half sleep, half waking, half sleep. So anyhow, he thought that was quite frightening.
Now, one of the ways, sorry for, this is a really connected to this, I believe. One of the ways, and I think this actually usually happens to me in the afternoons. Like I really rarely sleep in the afternoons, only if I'm really tired. Yes. But in the afternoons when I go to sleep, I can actually notice when I'm going to sleep, because all of these weird thoughts and these like dreamlike images start appearing in front of me. Of course, when I have my eyes closed, even though I'm not sleeping just yet. So that might be that.
That's a hypnagogic state. But I don't want to get off to another sidebar, but have you ever had a lucid dream? Do you understand what a lucid dream is?
After I watched Inception, I've trained myself to do it, and I only had it once. But yeah, I had it once.
I've only had it once or twice. A lucid dream, just to explain, is a dream where you know you're dreaming, and you can control your dreams. So if you're having a dream where you're flying, you want to fly, you can fly, and you can fly up or you can fly down, you can look at things. It's a wonderful experience. Yes. And you know you're dreaming. You know it's just a dream, so nothing's going to hurt you in the dream. So anyhow, to move it on. So I developed this mind mirror, and I built it so you could process the data through a computer. So I remodeled their machine. I built the electronics, and I wrote this program so I could actually download I could just plug it into my computer. and I could see the waves on the computer screen, so it made it much easier to analyze it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was taken up by one or two television programs in England and in America as well, who thought this was fascinating, you know. I don't know why. Anyhow, and then I was approached by a businessman who said, have you tried seeing how when people are watching, say, a television commercial, you know, I said, well, no, you know, why should I want to do that? And then I thought, well, maybe he's right, because it'd be interesting to see a television commercial is a 30-second or so piece of television designed to catch your attention and hold your attention and sell the product. Now, that's it. What would be happening to somebody's brain in that 30 seconds, which is deliberately designed, far more than most programs are, I have to say, to hold your attention, or at least to catch your attention. Because unless they catch your attention, they're not going to make you watch the rest. So anyhow, I started to do that, and I found some quite interesting results. And so people came in with a lot of money. So so the greed part of my flag
was flagged.
well, academics very seldom have much money, as you may know. Students certainly don't have much money, and academic professors don't get what they think they ought to get. So I decided to be interested to try this and have some money for my experimentation. And so Mindlab took off, and in the early days we would fly people out to all over the world. They would have their equipment with them, which weighed a ton. It cost a fortune on air freight, and they would fit electrodes, and they would take their recordings, and we would try and analyze them. But I can analyze if I were to fit electrodes on your brain, on your head, not on your actually physically on your brain, I would leave your skull intact. I would just put them on the outside of your skull. You know, that's fine. I could tell what some things about what was going on in your brain. But if I get 100 people, how can I quantify these data? You know, is there any way you could do it? And we decided, after spending a lot of money and about 2 years research, you couldn't do it. And besides which, there are two other problems to that kind of research, which was hugely popular. We were getting demands from all over the world to do this. First of all, you could only have a small sample size. You can't do perhaps more. How many people can you do? How long have you got? How much money have you got? So our subject number would be about 12 or 20 at the most.
Yeah, small.
Well, n equals 12 is better than n equals 1, which is how most people will live their lives. But, you know, so now with our new methods, which are all done by computer, we can have n equals 20,000. You know, we can recruit 100,000 Nigerian subjects. And then we can break them down. We can break them down by age, for example, or by gender, by sex, or we can break them down in any sort of way we want. So now Mindlab, which is, you know, a very successful business, I should say. It's not an academic. So we do produce a lot of academic papers, which you can find on our website. But no, we can do a lot more people where we don't have to fly people. We don't have to, which we couldn't do, of course, today. I mean, even in COVID, we can recruit people. You know, 20,000 people in your country, for example, if we were asked to do so. And they would all get paid, and they would be happy to do that. It's a quick thing you do on your computer. You can do it at home. You don't have to go to a laboratory and have people stick electrodes on your head.
Yeah, it's quick and easy, and you make money off.
Quick and easy, and it therefore is better for our backers to make money out of it.
Yeah, but I mean, looking at the Mindlab International's work at the present day, I'm interested in two things predominantly. One, of course, you know, there are 4 predominant spheres that Mindlab is working through, as far as I've understood by watching your website. But I know it's a broad subject, but what might have been not only Mindlab's, but also your findings in the sphere of consumer behavior that you found most fascinating, and what might be the one or the two things that keep eluding you and in your own research and the Mindlab's research that you just cannot seem to find reasons as to why they're happening or why they are not happening?
Well, I think I would say two things, and good, they're very interesting questions. I think I say what I find very interesting. Now, we can think in one of two ways. These are generally called System 1 or System 2, but in my book, The Brain Cell, I call them System I and System R, because I think it, so System I, or System R, let's deal with that. It means you're buying things very rationally. Now, my partner buys things very rationally. She will go onto the internet, she will look at all the price comparisons, she'll look at all the, you know, the feedback on different things, and she may take 6 months to buy something, which drives me mad because I like to do things quickly.
There was a good comparison in your book, like a SWAT team, basically. Just go in, take it, take out.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, we're a good partnership because we substitute for one of those strengths and weaknesses. But the impulse buying is when you buy basically without really thinking about it. And this research suggests uses a different part of the brain, different areas of the brain, and it's much less energy demanding, because people don't think of their brain as demanding a lot of energy, but in fact your brain demands a lot of energy. It's one of the most energy consuming organs in your body.
Yeah, I've heard that, but I just can't believe it. I mean, of course it's true, even though I can't believe it, but it's like mind-boggling.
Yeah, because the whole time your brain is working, it's processing sounds. And what are sounds? Sounds are vibrations, which the brain then decomposes into language, you know, which you understand. If you don't understand it, it's merely a series of sounds. You know, I mean, I don't speak Japanese, and it sounds to me just a series of sounds.
Of course.
But if I learned Japanese or I knew Japanese, then it would be, my brain would interpret it. So again, vision. You tend to think your eyes see things. Your eyes don't see things. Your eyes are pulling at seeing things. Your brain sees things through your eyes. So the brain has to spend a lot of energy just doing the basic things. And while we're talking together, you know, our bodily functions, I hope, are working. Our hearts are beating. Our meals are being digested. So all this uses a lot of energy. But if you're having to think about how you buy things, you're using more energy, and it's tiring. If you just, I get that. And I've got a little video, I don't know when I sent it to you, of people talking about their impulse buys.
No.
I can send that to you. It's fascinating. I mean, people talk about buying chocolates on impulse, for example. But one person admits they went and bought a house on impulse.
I mean, of course, if the financials means allow for that.
Well, I don't know. They didn't look very rich, but they said, yes, we were driving to our mother-in-law's house for Sunday lunch, and we saw these houses. So we went in and looked at one, and we bought it. And then we had lunch. So, you know, I think none of us, I certainly wouldn't buy a house like that. I'd want to know a bit more about the house and how I was going to afford it. But nonetheless, so I'm very interested in why people are so easily influenced. As you kindly read my book, The Brain Cell, and you know how we're being influenced by outside sources all the time.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating things, and this is something that everybody, I believe, should not constantly, but from time to time remind themselves of, is, as you pointed out repeatedly, especially in the beginning of the book, is that even though that we believe that we're in the control of our own thoughts and of our own behavior, that's really not the case. There are so many outside factors that are influencing us both, and this is like one of the digressions that I made inside my own brain while reading the book, is that the way that we're influenced could be like based on two levels. It's like one is really the subconscious one. For example, like, I don't know, like an order of products on a shelf for whatever reason. And the other one could be like a level above the emotional one. So the emotions are, yet again, of course, the subconscious ones, but we can understand them much more easily. That's just my point of view.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we are influenced by all sorts of things. The color of a packet, on a brand, for example. In my book, I talk about how there's one theory that when you have a cartoon character drawn on a cereal box, which is intended for children, they will always angle the eyes of the cartoon character. So a child at child height will give eye contact, because giving eye contact to another person is one of the ways we associate, we link up with them. So anyhow,
There's so much. I mean, like, what do you think is like what has been the most surprising thing that you found out for yourself in terms of this consumer behavior research?
I think I was surprised and perhaps shocked that how easily influenced we are, and by the phrase consumerism, I would say not just consuming purchases, products and services, but consuming everything we have in life, which, you know, means politically, socially, environmentally, everything we believe in, everything we hold to be true. So often when we investigate it, we realize it was false evidence appearing real. You know, and I think so many of our lives, certainly of my patients' lives or my clients' lives, I must say that I don't like the phrase patients. They're not sick in any way. They're clients or they're students, I suppose, almost. But, you know, I was taught a very good thing by my PhD supervisor, who was also a clinical psychologist, obviously. And he said, look, the relationship between a therapist and a client should be one of a PhD. This is rather an academic story, but it should be one of a PhD supervisor and a PhD student, or indeed somebody who's supervising your master's degree, and you yourself. The student probably knows more about that particular subject than anybody else in the world, because actually a doctor of philosophy means you've studied one subject so intensively, you actually do have knowledge which other people would like to have, or more knowledge. So that's what the student brings to the party, a greater knowledge of a particular small area, whatever they're studying. What the PhD supervisor brings to the party is the understanding of how things can go wrong in research and how people can make mistakes in a general way. So in a sense, the student knows where she or he is going, and the supervisor knows when they're going on the right road, or perhaps when they're taking a misturning. And I think that's exactly the same as I see myself with clients. I see myself, you know, they are the expert on their phobia. They know more about being a emetophobe or a hemophobe or an arachnophobe or a claustrophobe or an agrophobe than anybody else in the world. They have a doctorate in phobias.
Yes.
Or that particular phobia. But I know what will work, what is the right road to go on, and what road will take them on a byway which won't get them any, or a dead end.
Yeah, basically your role is a leadership one, basically to showcase what's...
I would say a guide more than a leader.
Yes.
They are leading themselves, but I'm trying to show them which direction, which path to take. You know, it's like, I think you're just showing them, well, you can do this if you like, but, you know, perhaps you might find this, why don't you try this before you try that?
Yeah.
It's really trying to guide people along what I think is a more effective pathway to overcoming their fear, overcoming their whatever their problem. The problem is mostly I deal with fear.
Yeah, but I mean, plus an additional factor, I believe, is, you know, that they see and that they feel and that they notice that they're not being treated as a problem, but as a fellow human being.
That's right, exactly. You know, in the medical arena, there is a patient and there's a doctor, and that suggests a power relationship between the doctor who knows everything. Yeah. Well, very often they don't. Or and the patient who is the subservient person who must do what the doctor says. You know,
there's a clear cut.
For many, that's why I don't like the term patient. I'm not telling my patients what to do. I can't tell them what to do. They know what to do. You know, and you know, you can just guide them in the right direction. Yeah, or hopefully what you think is a better direction than the direction they were perhaps thinking of. So I don't think a good direction, if you're an agoraphobic, is to spend the rest of your life in your kitchen. You know, I don't think a good way for the partner of an agoraphobic to behave is to encourage him or her, usually, to stay in the kitchen. I think a better way would be to just say, can we go to the front gate, just have a look at the street? And then maybe we could just go 5 yards down down the road and then go back home safely, you know. So this is a technique called progressive desensitization in vivo. I bet you like that. Progressive, gradually. Desensitization, you're desensitizing to their fears. In vivo just means in real life. So try to do everything very, very gradually. You know, you go one step at a time. I think that's the way we try and treat a phobia. Don't try and, there is a technique in treating phobias called flooding, where you expose the person to the worst kind of fear they can ever imagine, and they become panicky, but then the panic subsides. You see, it's very quick. If you have somebody, for example, we had a nurse who wanted to work. I know, she was a teacher. She wanted to work in Africa, and she had to have injections in order to fly out there. And she was a needle phobic, and she had to go in about a few days' time. So we had no time to progressively desensitize her to needles, which is a very common fear. So we flooded her. We had her in the laboratory, and we made her inject oranges. We had some medical students who injected each other. And so all she saw for several hours was injections. And it was horrible for us. We hated doing it. And she became very afraid, but she calmed down. And then finally, after about 8 hours, she said, "Okay, give me the injection. I can take the injection."
It's a really extreme way of doing it, but an effective one, especially after they see that nothing's going to happen, basically.
Well, yes, exactly. Unfortunately, for our best laid schemes, there was so much tension in our room that when it came to giving her the injection, the nurse who was supposed to give her the injection fainted. So
the nurse fainted.
The nurse was so panic-stricken herself.
There's a new phobia in the development.
There's another phobia, a phobia about patients I have for clients. Anyhow, so things can go wrong. The best laid schemes of mice and men, as the Scots would say, gag after glay, go wrong. So you don't have 100% success in therapy. Sometimes. I mean, I had an agoraphobic woman who'd been in prison for 20 years behind her front door, and I'm treating her very successfully. And then the husband intervened and said, "No, I don't want my wife to have. I bought her a new kitchen, so she's got something different to look at." So that was a failure failure on our parts as well. There we are. That's how I think.
Yeah, I mean, everything kind of comes back both from the doctor and patient relationship. I mean, when looked at it through the traditional lens, and to the partnership, like the partnership between two partners, of course, it's always not. I mean, it's predominantly due to how supportive and how the human relations between the two people are developed. Because I mean, how is the person supposed to overcome a certain phobia if she or he doesn't trust you as a psychologist, first and foremost?
They must trust you. They must believe in you. They must think what you're offering is authentic and not mumbo jumbo or some kind of, which they would regard as mumbo jumbo. But again, the relationship between students, or particularly pupils, young students, and their teachers is critical. We all have a favorite teacher. She may not be somebody we liked particularly, but somebody who we know is a very effective teacher. And we learn from them, or somebody who's very empathic and very, we believed in them. But I think, I'll give you a true story of a hostile teacher. Well, I'm not empathetic. I had a student, a client who was Asperger Syndrome. Asperger's is a type of mental illness, but you're very, very bright in certain areas. This was a very, very bright boy. I mean, he was a member of Mensa, which is an organization for people with a high IQ. And so he was, but the thing about him, he was very easily led by his friends. So his friends would tell him to do something naughty. He was about 14 or 15 when this story occurred. And he would do it. And his teacher took him to one side and said, "Look, you mustn't do what people tell you. You're leading you into trouble." So he said, being a smart kid, but not particularly a bright kid socially. So he said, "So I shouldn't do what you tell me." So she said, no, you must always do what the adult tells you. but you mustn't do what a child tells you. So so I said, always do what an adult tells me. So she said, yes, that's what I'm telling you. Always do what an adult tells you. So he said, so if a man asks me to get into his car and wants to drive me away, I should get into his car and let him drive me away. She said, no, you mustn't do that. So, so he said, but you told me to do what adults say. So she said, I'm bored with you. Go and sit at the back of the class. So, that was a very bad way of dealing with it. But, I mean, he was a very logical child. And what she was saying was illogical.
Yeah, nothing failed in the terms of logic.
No, exactly. And if you're a very logical person, you will regard most human beings as very strange.
Yeah, very strange. So I just want to digress. It's been 1 hour and 15 minutes since we started talking.
Really?
Do you have time to continue?
No, that's absolutely fine. Well, another 5 minutes, would that be all right?
Yeah, it's completely fine by me. I'm just, concerned about your free time and if you have any other obligations. And
no, that'd be fine. Another 5 minutes would be delightful. It's been delightful speaking to you. I hope I haven't rambled on too much. I do tend to go.
No. This is amazing. It's all basically new information. I can already tell you, that I'm hoping to get a second conversation sometime in the future again.
Of course.
Okay,
of course.
So even though I understand and I'm really, really willing to continue talking to you, not to take too much of your time additionally, I would like to hear about your current and perhaps future plans with Mindlab International. Like, what are you working on in terms of okay, let me actually rephrase this and come back to the question that I want to ask in the beginning. Which findings in the research of Mindlab do you think have actually influenced the work of, I know that you despise the term of the neuromarketing the most? And what do you believe and which current research do you believe will aid that sort of research most at the present moment?
I think we are understanding much more from a clinical point of view from a clinical psychology, which has always been my main interest. I'm not really very interested. I think the commercial world is fascinating because I think it tells us things about how the brain is influenced. But I think we're trying to find out more about how we can help people relax by perhaps giving them better techniques. I mean, the technique we use for relaxation now, for example, muscular relaxation, that goes back to the early parts of the 20th century, Jacobson's relaxation. And I think there are much better ways. And maybe there'll be ways of actually some kind of electronic device which people can just put on their foreheads, which will read the brain activity and then maybe in some way help them relax mentally. I don't know. That sounds like 1984, the Brave New World.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are very worried about that. But I think I'd like people to have a better understanding on how they are influenced, subconsciously especially, by the messages going on around them and how this dictates their behavior. Because I think it's so easy to become a puppet. It's so easy to become basically a puppet being manipulated by outside sources. And these days, the outside sources are so huge, and internet and social media, we're bombarded by information. It's very hard to become more reflective and to give yourself, perhaps you want one message to give people: you all need me time where you simply devoted to yourself. That's not being selfish, it's not being, shutting other people out. You can have other people come into your world for most parts of your working day, but nonetheless, for some time, you just need to be yourself. You need to go away somewhere quiet. You just need to experience silence, or silence with some music. For example, Baroque music by the Baroque composers, Vivaldi, for example. I've been shown to produce some very positive brain effects, and they're very good at relaxing.
The Four Seasons, if I can.
Four Seasons, of course, yes. But certainly Mozart, Vivaldi, the whole range of these Baroque composers produce music in such a way that music does have a powerful influence on us. It affects the brain in very deep ways. So maybe to try to develop some kind of musical effect which would help people deeply relax. And we did some research in that area some years ago. We didn't come up with any conclusions. But I think the thing is just to realize how easily influenced we are by things. And if we were to really step back and think about them, and think about them using our system, our system, our reasonable, our rational system rather than our impulsive system, life might become a lot easier for us. And try to put things into perspective.
Yeah, to kind of combine our system with a system of not the system, but with complete relaxation.
Yes.
With the moment where we're thinking clearly, but also the moment where we can just relax and not think about anything.
And I also find that you need to persevere with relaxation or meditation, because very often what we found in our research was when people start to relax, they become more anxious.
Yes.
You get a rebound. You know, I built a toy train set. Well, I didn't build a train set. I built a controller for the train set, which was wired to people's brains through an EEG device. And so when people relaxed, when they produced a lot of alpha rhythms, the train would move round the track.
Okay.
And when they became more alert, more anxious, the train would stop. And I would train executives at senior level in companies, and they were so ambitious. These guys, they were so mostly guys. They were so competitive that as soon as they saw they were relaxing, they became anxious about not being able to relax further.
And this is biofeedback, basically.
Yes, biofeedback on the train. The train would move around the track. I can send you a video of this showing it working.
Yeah, of course, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a television company came and made a program about this, and so I've got this video which I can send on.
Okay, sure. Okay.
I don't think they'll ever see it in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so yes, I'll happily send that to you. It's interesting. So I think if we could develop techniques like this, so people could see that they're relaxing. Actually, we live in an empirical world. We like to have proof. We're all doubting Thomases in our own ways. We prove it to me in a lot of cases. And if you can show them something working, then I think they'd be more to accept it, to trust it, and to do it.
Especially for the highly driven people.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Because, flying a desk can be even if you're allowed to these days, it can be very stressful. And I've had a lot of very successful, very rich people who've become overly stressed. They've suffered heart disease or, some kind of disease resulting from years of being chronic stress. And chronic stress is much harder to deal with than the acute stress.
Yes.
Acute stress is where you become stressed for a very short amount of time. You're no longer stressed. But if you're under chronic stress for a period of time, whether the people I saw in early part of my life in war zones, in conflict zones, become hugely stressed. These injuries will last. I mean, we have soldiers in this country now who fought in Afghanistan or elsewhere, and they have a huge level of mental illness and post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah, I mean,
so just because you're not wounded where you can see blood doesn't mean you're not wounded, and that wound may well last longer than a physical wound, which will heal.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, there's a case here for the former Yugoslavia. In my case, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's only been in the last couple of years that, from my personal point of view, that the number of cases of people with the mental illnesses has started really increasing. And that's something that I found out only later on, is that PTSD doesn't necessarily show itself after only a year or two. It sometimes takes a lot of time for itself to show, and some sort of a trigger that can actually trigger it. And of course, it's shown in all forms. It's not just, the worst of forms, but it's also in those minuscule forms that, yet again, just from my point of view, like phobias, it's not just one thing. It's one thing influencing a whole range, a whole life.
And that changes every aspect of your life. And then you become very depressed because your life, you see, is not as exciting or as varied or as vivid as it used to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is actually a conversation for the second episode, because I would love us for the second episode to talk a little bit more maybe about the consumer behavior. Although this talk about the fear and the anxiety and the phobias is really interesting to me, and it's something that even though I'm studying marketing, it's kind of something that moves me, I believe, a little bit more intrinsically. I don't know why, but it's just, I believe it's because it's much closer to human nature in and of itself, other than having to, take an intellectual component, such as, various components that take from marketing. So basically, not to take any more of your time, I would just like to ask you.
Very much. It's been a fascinating hour or so, and the time has flown, as they say in this country. But and your English, I mean, I congratulate you. It is so superb. Gosh, I wish my French was now as good as your English.
Thank you. I mean, the conversation in of itself. I mean, let me just check how much time has passed. 1 hour and 25 minutes. I mean, it's almost like I really hope that we'll be able to make a second episode, perhaps sometimes in January, if you have time.
Whatever you like, just drop me an email. I hope we can keep in touch, because I'm really fascinated, by your whole attitude to life, and it's lovely. It's lovely to speak with somebody in another country, because nowadays I have a lot of friends in Germany, but we exchange emails. But it's nice to actually see you.
Sure. I mean, I can also send you some videos from Bosnia and Herzegovina so you can get a better picture. We have wonderful nature. We have awful politicians, a lot of corruption, a lot of nepotism, quite a bit of unemployment, but we have beautiful nature, and the people are really, really warm. So I think you'll enjoy seeing the videos.
Well, I love my time in Yugoslavia. One of the stories I covered was, in those days, a communist, of course, labor camp for young people. It wasn't a prison place. People went out voluntarily to volunteer for community work. And a group of English people came out, and so I went out with them to photograph them at work. I could send you some pictures.
Yes, please. Okay.
They were mostly Yugoslavians or whatever, but they were building I think widening a river, and they were using it. They weren't using bulldozers, earth moving. They were using buckets and spades.
Yeah, this was like, I mean, this is something, I can't remember the expression in our language, but it's like youth actions. Basically, a lot of youth would come in and help rebuild and build the country. It's something that I believe the world and our countries in of themselves today really lack a lot. The solidarity and just the willingness to go in. Very good.
And they said we're not using. I don't think they had much earth moving equipment, but they said it's better for them to see the physical results of their physical labor.
Yeah.
Cheaper as well.
It's at least cheaper, especially, I mean, in the times of communism. But not to digress, I've really had an enjoyable time with you, and we will certainly keep in touch in terms of the email, and also make sure to send you the videos. But before we end the episode in of itself, I would just like to ask one final question for now.
Yes.
Do you have a message for young people?
I think the future, I know it's cliche to say the future is with our young people. I think young people are getting a very raw deal at the moment, particularly in our country because of COVID, and particularly most of Western Europe. They're finding their education is being disrupted. If they're at school, their university education is being disrupted. They have hardly any work. And when in our infinite wisdom, and I use that ironically, we leave the European Union at the end of this month. I mean, already we have got something like over 2 million unemployed. And young people, particularly, are the ones who are suffering. And I think I would just say to them, don't give up. Keep going. What I found in my life, and I've had many setbacks in my life, and many, trying to break into journalism is very hard. So just persevere. Keep going.
Yeah, I mean, as my dad says, actually, it's like, if you try, you may have a 2% chance of succeeding, but if you don't try, you have a 0% chance.
That's exactly right.
So 2% is much better than 0.
Yes, there's no such thing as a failure. There's simply a path you are following. It doesn't work, so try another path.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for this. Thank you, and I hope yet again that we'll continue talking and that we'll make a second episode in January.
You might like to do, we could do something on the commercial side, although I'm less involved with that now. We could also do something if you're interested on body language.
Sure, why not? That's a really interesting topic.
Oh, well, I wrote a book on body language.
Can you remind me the name of it?
I think it was called The Secret Language of Success, which was how people succeed or fail very often, not so much on what they say, but
on the body language.
Non-verbal, yeah.
Okay, so
we could perhaps have a look at that.
Sure.
Anyhow.
Okay, it's a deal. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Good luck. Have a good day. Bye.